This episode contains descriptions of violence against children that may be difficult for some listeners. If you wish to avoid this kind of content, consider sitting this one out. Welcome to Crime and Sacrifice. My name is Brianna, and this is episode 12, The Alphabet Killer. For anybody that's been listening to earlier cases on this podcast, the setting for this crime is again Rochester, New York. Rochester is a manufacturing city located in western New York, a blustery lakefront town that is cold and snowy in the winter and often beautiful and warm in the summer, if prone to cloudiness and rain. It's generally a blue-collar city with a population now over 1 million people. And like a lot of cities with disparity between different social classes, the city has a stark separation between the large houses on the wide, tree-lined streets of East Avenue and the former drug dens boarded up on streets like Lyle and Lake Avenues. These were the hunting grounds of serial killer Arthur Shawcross. In the 1970s, economic conditions in the city were particularly difficult, mirroring the economy of the country in general. This led to crime and ultimately gave way to communities and neighborhoods devastated by drugs. There were many blue-collar workers, many of them Italian, Irish, and of Polish descent, who found work at various factories in town or at companies like Eastman Kodak. These communities worked hard, finding a home in Rochester. Attitudes were different at the time about how close an eye you should keep on your kids. A lot of families felt comfortable letting even young children outside alone, oblivious or insulated from the fear of those that might wish their children harm. In 1971, 10-year-old Carmen Colon was living with her grandparents in Bull's Head, a neighborhood in the southwest area of the city. Carmen had been born in Puerto Rico and moved to Rochester while she was still very young. She had a contagious smile and an independent streak, especially for a girl her age. Carmen and her family had their ups and downs, but were generally happy, despite living in one of the poorer neighborhoods in Rochester at the time, and battling with extreme poverty themselves. Her mother was only 16 years old when Carmen was born, but thankfully had the support of her parents to help them get by. Carmen also struggled with nightmares and a learning disability that kept her isolated from her peers, making everyday life a challenge some days. But things seemed like they were looking up for Carmen when she went to live with her grandparents full-time. According to one of Carmen's cousins, she and her grandparents were always very close, and living with a couple that adored her so much gave Carmen the security she needed. The strong bond they shared was mutual, and Carmen loved helping her grandparents however she could, enjoyed the feeling of responsibility that came with running small errands for them. On November 16th of that year, it was a day like any other for Carmen and her grandparents. They had a prescription that they needed picked up at the local pharmacy. Though Carmen and her grandfather would often make that trip together, on this particular day, Carmen insisted on going alone, wanting to show how mature she was. And her grandparents had no fear in letting her go alone. Again, it was kind of a different time, and the fear or acknowledgement of the evil out there was so much less pervasive than it is today. At around 4:20 p.m., Carmen entered the pharmacy on West Main Street alone, telling the clerk that she was there to pick up a prescription for her grandmother, when she was informed that the prescription was not ready yet, and shop owner Jack Corbin watched the girl leave the store alone. There were a couple of witnesses outside that saw her get into a car in the parking lot, though nobody thought much of it at the time. But as the minutes turned to an hour, then 2, Carmen's grandparents became increasingly concerned about her, knowing that she should have been back by then. Worry turned to panic, and by 7:50 p.m., when there was still no sign of Carmen, her grandparents called the Rochester Police Department to report her missing. The officers assured the couple that they should not panic, that chances were good that Carmen would show up. Maybe she had wandered off or lost track of time, or, worst case scenario, maybe she had gotten lost somewhere, but that they would find her. And the family's fears were calmed by the act of doing something. And yet the hours dragged on without any sign of Carmen. Soon one day passed, then two, as the fear intensified for the family. They felt that something terrible must have happened. On November 18th, 1971, two teenage boys were cycling along Stearns Road when they spotted what they thought was a partially clothed mannequin or doll. Instead, it was the tiny body of Carmen Colon, found in a secluded gully close to the town of Churchville and about a 20-minute drive from the pharmacy where Carmen had last been seen. Police arrived and recognized that this was their missing little girl, faced with the impossible task of letting Carmen's grandparents know that she was gone. Even more horrific was what somebody had done to Carmen before she died, and another warning that we're going to describe what happened to her if you want to skip ahead. Carmen was found mostly undressed, her body apparently dumped in a hurry. She had been beaten and raped, evidence of blunt force trauma all over her small body, and what the medical examiner determined were fingernail marks. She had died from manual strangulation. Some articles of her clothing were found nearby. Her pants were found further away, off the side of a nearby highway. And as reports of the little girl's murder sent shockwaves through the city and tips started flooding in, there was one incident in particular that police paid special attention to and linked almost immediately to Carmen's abduction and murder. Dozens of motorists reported a disturbing scene they had witnessed along Highway I-490, just an hour or so after Carmen had disappeared from the downtown pharmacy. At around 5:10 p.m., witnesses said there had been a little girl running alongside the highway, naked from the waist down and waving her arms frantically. In hindsight, some wondered if she might have been trying to flag down help. Other drivers reported seeing a car, possibly a Ford Pinto hatchback, reversing down the highway toward the little girl as she ran. And others noted a young man getting out of the car and leading the girl submissively back to his vehicle. Many of the drivers only saw a portion of this unfold, and only for a few moments as their cars whizzed past at 60 or 70 miles an hour. And tragically, none of them had even called police until after Carmen's brutalized body had been found. Afterward, a total of 38 motorists reported what they had seen. The community at the time was outraged further by these reports, that none of these motorists had stopped to try to help the little girl. And I understand their anger and frustration. Knowing what eventually happened, and especially given my familiarity with some of the most brutal stories out there in true crime, it's easy to judge these people, to feel betrayed as a society that they didn't stop to help. But I've given this some thought, and I feel like it says more about human rationalization than indifference. I think it's much more likely that the drivers figured that they were seeing something more innocent than it appeared to be. That maybe they thought it was a daughter acting up with her father, that the girl was simply throwing some kind of fit. Or maybe they questioned what they had seen at all after speeding past so quickly. I think the societal feeling of innocence or giving people the benefit of the doubt was a product of the time as well. And of course, this was also the 1970s. People didn't have cell phones at the time. They would have had to call police once they arrived at their destination, or at the absolute best, maybe once they pulled off at the next exit, which could be 5 to 10 minutes away on a highway like that. And by the time police arrived, chances are Carmen and her abductor would have been gone. The most somebody might have been able to do is to stop on the highway and intervene. But again, I think by the time it registered, they would have already driven past and started rationalizing the whole thing. So yeah, it's easy to judge or condemn them, but those are my thoughts on it. Regardless of what you think about their actions that day, we still have to give people credit for coming forward at all, even after the fact. And certainly some of the drivers felt horrible that they hadn't thought more of it or done more at the time. That alone takes a certain kind of courage. One of the drivers that eventually came forward was a man named Jeff Peters, who was 25 years old at the time, commuting home from a nearby town called Batavia with his wife. They only glimpsed the girl for a moment and only put what they had seen together in hindsight after hearing of the murder of Carmen Colon. In the immediate aftermath, the Rochester community was reeling as parents vowed on local news broadcasts to keep a closer eye on their children. And many local businesses and newspapers began offering a reward for information that would lead to her killer. Carmen's funeral took place just a few days after her body was found on November 22, 1971. 200 people attended. As for the police investigation, without DNA evidence or any other solid leads to go on, it wasn't long before the trail seemed to go cold. They interviewed several promising suspects in the months that followed, and yet every single time, the suspect was cleared. And as the initially large task force dwindled, soon there were only a few detectives assigned to the case, and it seemed inevitable that it would not be solved. But of course, Carmen's family and neighbors could not just move on, and the public investigation continued. Early the following year, in 1972, several businesses and newspapers banded together to pay for 5 large billboards asking the community for leads in the case. You can find images of what the billboard looked like online, but we'll also have links on our website at crimeandsacrifice.com. There were 5 30-foot-high billboards in total that featured a picture of Carmen along with the following text: "Who killed Carmen Colon? Please help before it happens again. Rewards for information total $6,000. Be a secret witness." That reward would be the equivalent of $40,000 today. And several leads did come in from the billboards, but police were dismayed that none seemed to get them closer to solving the case. And the pain and presence of this crime in the larger community would eventually fade, as it always does. After 17 months had passed, Rochester returned to a semblance of normal for those who didn't know Carmen personally, with law enforcement hoping that Carmen's murder would be an isolated crime. Families who had been watching their children more closely became more lenient, and life went on. But the city was rocked again when another little girl disappeared on Rochester streets in the spring of 1973. This time, it was a little girl named Wanda Walkowitz, an 11-year-old with bright red hair and freckles, known as a tomboy with an almost boundless amount of energy. She much preferred playing with the boys in the neighborhood than sitting at home and playing quietly with Barbies. She was tough, and in some ways she had to be, living in a rough neighborhood, often picked on at school and prone to getting into fights. Her family had gone through tough times. Her sister Rita recalled in a later interview that it had been hard living in a cramped apartment with their mother, Joyce, recently out of work, and their baby sister, Michelle. Their father had passed away from a heart attack, and their mother was left to care for them on her own. Joyce relied on her girls to help with the housework and other errands, and would often send them to the supermarket alone. On a particularly gray April day in 1973, Wanda went out at 5 p.m. to collect groceries for the family's dinner, as she had countless times before. Out on a family errand alone, just as Carmen had been. She arrived at the supermarket as planned and purchased a few essentials: tuna, milk, and cat food. And the shop's owner reported that she left with her bag of groceries around 5:15 p.m., walking in the direction of her home on a street named Conkey Avenue. That was the last confirmed sighting of Wanda alive. Wanda's mother, Joyce, began to grow uneasy as minutes slipped past and her daughter was still not back. The store was only just up the street, and by 6 p.m., she felt like something might be wrong. Of course, she tried to set aside her fears and rationalize the timing, thinking that it probably wasn't something serious, that she was overreacting. But as the streets began to darken and there was still no sign of Wanda, Joyce could wait no longer and reported the disappearance to police at 8 p.m. With Carmen's murder still fresh in their minds, police wasted no time in canvassing the neighborhood to look for Wanda. They had upwards of 50 detectives scouring nearby streets within a couple of hours, searching within a 7-mile radius of her home and giving special attention to areas known to be frequented by kids in the neighborhood, including some areas near the Genesee River Gorge. Hours later, they had still had no success in finding Wanda, but started to piece together what had happened to her as they talked with neighbors, some of whom recalled seeing a girl with a large bag of groceries near Avenue B. Some classmates believed that they may have seen Wanda resting with a bag against a fence. They also recalled something else, a brown car on the street nearby that seemed to be moving very slowly. As the night wore on, police and family members tried to remain optimistic, but many had an ominous feeling that there were still no solid traces of the girl. That is, until a New York State trooper made a gruesome discovery near a rest stop along Irondequoit Bay in Webster. At 10:15 a.m., their worst fears were confirmed as investigators descended on Wanda's lifeless body and tried to piece together what had happened. Though she was fully clothed, it was apparent to police that she had met a violent end. An autopsy revealed that she too had been sexually assaulted and strangled, just as Carmen had been, though they noted that the manner of strangulation was different, that Wanda had been killed from behind with a kind of ligature, possibly a belt. It seemed that her body had also been dumped there hastily, as if the killer hadn't planned that far ahead and didn't know how or where to dispose of the body of his young victim. There were also signs that Wanda had struggled desperately for her life, something that was no surprise to the people who knew her, the fight that she'd always had. She had a number of defensive wounds on her body. Police combed the scene for evidence and ultimately uncovered semen and pubic hair that could be instrumental in identifying the perpetrator. They also noted the presence of white cat fur on her clothing, significant because the family didn't have a cat with fur that matched. On April 6th, Wanda Walkowicz was buried in a white and gold casket at Holy Sepulchre Cemetery, a Catholic cemetery and also the final resting place of Carmen Colon. Again, the public was left reeling with the horror of this crime. That somebody could do something so evil to a child. And parents were again left to question how much freedom they should give their kids, especially now when it seemed like this killer was a repeat offender, that he would not stop on his own. Police went to work to try to see if the case was related to Carmen, with some investigators thinking that clearly it was, and others remaining skeptical. But whatever stance or opinion they displayed publicly, one of the investigators assigned to Carmen's case was asked to help with Wanda's murder as well, apparently evidence that they considered a link between the two cases a possibility. The public was also left to try to cope with or understand what was happening in their midst and who could be responsible. And this is the first time that another connection was made between the two girls. As the public began reviewing these cases, some noted that there were many similarities between the two victims. Not only were the girls around the same age and from poor Rochester neighborhoods and Catholic backgrounds, some also made another eerie revelation: that both girls' first and last names started with the same initial, Carmen Colon and Wanda Walkowicz. More alarming still was the fact that their bodies were found in or near locations on the outskirts of the city with that same initial as the girl's name, Carmen found near Churchville and Wanda found in Webster. The connection was made, but of course many at this stage believed it was just some strange coincidence in the case. And there were still a lot of people in the community and in law enforcement that did not believe the cases were related. And investigators went to work on Wanda's case, gathering leads and piecing together what might have happened. One anonymous caller told police that they had seen a girl matching Wanda's description getting into a car on the night of her disappearance, a car that matched the description of the one that her classmates had given police that night, a brown vehicle and possibly a Dodge Dart. A couple of other local girls also said that there was some guy in the neighborhood that had tried to get them to get into his car, but they had refused. It wasn't long before police picked up a suspect that was unknown to the public, authorities assuring the community that they were closing in on an arrest. But 12 hours later, their mystery suspect had been released, his alibi holding up and having passed a polygraph test, enough to convince police that he must be telling the truth. They investigated countless other leads, but in another cruel echo of Carmen's case, each seemed to fizzle out until police once again found the investigation was at a standstill. Members of the community banded together to help again, now offering a reward of $10,000 for any information that could lead to the apprehension of Wanda and possibly Carmen's killer. But despite the countless hours spent tracking down lead after lead, police found themselves no closer to pinning down Wanda's killer. Months passed, and it seemed increasingly inevitable that Wanda's case would also grow cold, despite the best efforts of police and a community increasingly desperate to capture whatever murderer was living among them. A local TV program even attempted to recreate Wanda's disappearance as relayed by witnesses in September of that year, showing images of a similar girl carrying groceries and getting into a brown car, in the hope that the images would spark a memory from somebody that might be able to provide that vital clue to police. But despite another influx of tips, Rochester police found themselves no closer to finding Wanda's killer. As the fall wore on, there were fewer and fewer news reports on the case, and families began preparing themselves for the holiday season. In late November of 1973, 2 years had passed since the abduction and murder of Carmen, and just 7 months since Wanda had been killed. Michelle Maenza was 11 years old at the time and was a shy, sweet girl who tried to keep to herself, but was bullied mercilessly at school. On Monday, November 26th, the Monday after Thanksgiving that year, Michelle had even gone to the nurse's office in tears because the bullying had been so hurtful. She eventually calmed down enough to put on a brave face and go back to class. Michelle was also from a poor home, her mother Carolyn struggling to make ends meet for Michelle and her brother Stephen. She was expected home as usual after school that day, but the afternoon came and went with no sign of Michelle. Carolyn, of course, became increasingly anxious with her daughter's absence and called police that evening to report her missing. Police soon discovered that several classmates had seen Michelle around 3:15 that afternoon, walking from school toward a shopping plaza that was nearby. Carolyn had left her purse at one of the shops earlier that day, and Michelle was on her way to retrieve it for her mom. An uncle of Michelle's also reported that he had seen his niece near the shopping plaza that afternoon, and had even stopped and offered to give her a ride, according to Wanda's brother Stephen in an interview years later. But for some reason, Michelle declined. It was something that her uncle regretted for the rest of his life, that he had not insisted that she go with him on that day. Michelle never made it to the nearby shop to pick up her mother's purse. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. As police continued searching, they could not help but fear the worst. They didn't want to cause a panic, but as hours passed again without any sign of the girl, they asked if people could help in locating her. Witnesses came forward immediately, one claiming to have seen a girl that looked like Michelle sitting in the passenger seat of a brown or tan-colored car traveling at high speed down a nearby street. She was crying hysterically, according to the witness. Others also reported seeing a girl matching Michelle's description with a Caucasian man in his mid-20s or 30s at a local fast food restaurant in the city suburb of Penfield about an hour after she had disappeared. though nobody had thought the girl was in distress at the time. Another witness saw a brown or tan vehicle by the side of the road with a flat tire near the town of Walworth. The driver had stopped to offer assistance when he noticed that there was a little girl in the car that he later realized resembled Michelle. As the witness slowed and offered help, they reported that the man seemed to glare at them in a way that was threatening and to shake away their help, while standing in a way that seemed to purposefully obscure his license plate. The witness was shaken enough by the anger in the man's gaze that they drove off quickly, not knowing at the time that there was a little girl missing. And that was it. Those were all the tips that they had to go on, and police again put as many resources as they could spare on the case to try to find Michelle. Their search would come to an end 2 days later, as a local farmer found Michelle's body alongside a rural road in the town of Macedon, maybe 25 minutes from Michelle's last known whereabouts. Michelle was clothed, but police soon learned that she had also been raped and beaten. Blunt force injuries on her body and ligature marks on her neck in a very similar way to those on Wanda. Police also noted that there was foliage in one of Michelle's clenched fists that matched the area, indicating that the crime had taken place either where her body was found or somewhere nearby. They also found some white cat fur on her clothing, as in Wanda's case. Investigators were able to collect other significant evidence from her body, a partial palm print on her neck, and semen from her body and underwear. After the autopsy, police found that Michelle had eaten before she had died and after she disappeared, a meal of a hamburger that was most likely eaten an hour before death, making the sightings of a girl matching Michelle's description at a local fast food restaurant seem very credible. Police created a composite sketch of the man and soon released this image to the public. He was a young white man, likely in his mid-20s or mid-30s, with shaggy hair, a thin nose, and facial hair. You can find this sketch online, and there are also links on our website. Of course, it was time now for Michelle's family to grieve. They held an open casket funeral for the girl the following week. In a particularly wrenching moment, her father, Christopher, was quoted by local journalists saying that Michelle had been a sweet girl and that she hadn't fought much. Her family was also Catholic, and like the other 2 little girls, Michelle was laid to rest in Holy Sepulchre Cemetery. Again, police were inundated with tips and calls from the public and began looking into several promising leads in the immediate aftermath of her death. But the one piece of evidence or apparent clue that was now all over the headlines surrounding this crime was the fact that another little girl had been killed that fit the double initial theory of the killer selecting victims based on their first and last initials. Michelle Maenza was now the 3rd victim, her body found in the town of Macedon. Now it seemed like too much of a coincidence for even the most skeptical of investigators to ignore the connection, despite the implications of how deranged but calculated this killer might actually be, and the public was fascinated and terrified at the same time. Desperate to solve this case, police soon opened a dedicated hotline for tips on all 3 of these cases, fielding thousands of calls, and ultimately dealing with a suspect pool of around 800 possible killers. One by one, each suspect was investigated, and one by one, they were ruled out. Public speculation was also rampant as the theories about a murderer focusing on the initials of his victims sprang up everywhere, and publications focused on all of the other connections between these 3 victims. There were some very obvious similarities, of course, that they were all young girls, 10 or 11 years old, picked up by somebody in a car while walking alone along Rochester's streets. There were also some less obvious similarities that people wondered about, that the girls were all from Catholic families and living in poverty. But again, most striking was the pattern between the girls and the girls' names, with the same 2 initials for first and last name matching the initial of the town where their bodies were found, which suggested to many that the killer had been watching or stalking his victims, making the case that much more chilling, and leading to the unknown killer being dubbed the double-initial murderer or the alphabet killer. As speculation ran wild, others began trying to find some other patterns that this presumed criminal mastermind might have made. That perhaps their three initials together in the order that they died, C, W, and M, had some significance or was a code for some terrifying message that he was trying to send the world. Some speculated that it meant, "Come with me," maybe the words he used to get each girl to come into his car. But the investigators in this case, though they couldn't discount the similarities between the initials, also seemed to have gotten much less carried away by this speculation. They filed away the seemingly too extraordinary coincidence of the little girls' names, and instead looked at other similarities that they could investigate, that seemed tangible enough that they could help them narrow in on a suspect. They focused on the fact that each girl was sexually assaulted, providing the probable motive, that each had been fully or partially clothed before apparently and hurriedly being dumped on a secluded road. They also noted some other things about the victims that may have made them targets. The fact that they were young girls walking alone, but also that each was short for her age, perhaps giving the perpetrator additional confidence that they would ultimately be able to subdue them. They also noted some differences between the cases, found that Carmen was manually strangled from the front, that Wanda and Michelle were strangled from behind with a ligature, and that the latter two had been fed shortly before death, some strange act of mercy or guilt maybe, or maybe just another way of controlling the girls or calming their suspicions. Finally, it seemed significant that, though all of the victims were wearing some amount of clothing, that Carmen had been found almost completely naked, while Wanda and Michelle were almost completely clothed, something that would have had to happen after the sexual assaults, which suggested a certain level of respect or some contradictory desire to preserve some level of dignity. There was also the white fur found on both Wanda and Michelle that was not found on Carmen. Given these differences, it wasn't long before some investigators began to develop a theory that there were two killers, one that killed Carmen and was possibly someone known to her, maybe even a family member, and another killer that may have been inspired by the first crime, may have intentionally killed based on the initials, but that also maybe felt some degree of remorse for his actions. Regardless, it did seem like the second two crimes, the murders of Wanda and Michelle, were related, and that they still had either one or two child killers on their hands, and at least one of them was a potential serial killer. As police went through lead after lead, clearing suspect after suspect, it wasn't long before Michelle's case was also cold, as the public held its collective breath and waited for the moment where another little girl with the same first and last initial would turn up dead. It didn't happen. After Michelle's murder, it seems that the person or people responsible for these brutal killings just stopped, and police were left with only the evidence they had already collected in these crimes to try to figure out who had committed them. To this day, the cases have not been solved. Though every few years there is another small news article commemorating some anniversary of the crimes, or some new lead the police have investigated which, as of yet, has only led to more dead ends. As of the recording of this podcast, this case has become just another infamous part of Rochester lore, inspiring at least one movie, a fiction thriller only loosely based on this series of crimes called The Alphabet Killer, that was filmed in Rochester, and several documentary-style TV shows. Criminal profiler Roy Hazelwood came to a similar conclusion in a 2001 Discovery Channel documentary about the case. Hazelwood worked for decades with the FBI, and developed methods for profiling sexual predators. With a wealth of knowledge about these kinds of cases that seems very valuable. The documentary itself is a bit corny, with overly dramatic narration and some tasteless reenactments. But for people that are interested in the case, it does provide some useful insights. He and his team come to believe that there are two different killers, one that murdered Carmen and another that killed both Wanda and Michelle. They take it one step further, however, and conclude that the initial thing is actually just a complete coincidence, as crazy in a way as that seems. They base this on the fact that it would have to be a very calculated and methodical, patient killer that would track down these girls with the same last names, to stalk them patiently until just the right moment to abduct them. While this would be possible and is not without precedent in serial murder, they suggest that certain details of the case, the fact that the crimes seem very much like crimes of opportunity, the fact that the locations where the bodies were dumped appear to be hasty or disorganized, exposing the perpetrator to possibly getting caught while missing potentially better places to put the bodies nearby. That all of this suggests that the perpetrator isn't some criminal mastermind and wouldn't be capable of that level of planning. They point instead to somebody impulsive and remorseful. Of course, this is just their opinion, as the case has never been solved. And there have been plenty of killers of average intelligence without the best planning in the world that have stalked their victims. And one killer in particular that chose victims based on their first and last initial. That's been proven in court, but more on that later. All of the affected families in this case have preferred to stay out of the spotlight in the immediate aftermath of the crimes. But Carmen Colon's mother, Guillermina, made a statement to the public via Rochester newspaper, the Democrat and Chronicle, in the 90s, decades after her daughter's death. Guillermina said that despite living a hard life plagued with poverty, the only thing she still wanted was to know who had killed her daughter. She said, quote, "If I could die knowing who killed my Carmencita, I could die more peacefully than I have lived. It is the only thing I want in life, to know that this person had to pay for the terrible things he did to my little girl. If the person who did this could have any compassion, he would see the pain and suffering that the families of these little girls have gone through for all this time." Guillermina is still waiting for that comfort. That's not to say that there aren't several suspects that investigators strongly considered, and I think it's worth going into detail about some of them, as one or more of them may have been connected to one or more of these crimes. I don't make it a habit to name suspects, especially those that are eventually cleared. But the thing about the following people is that they're all pretty terrible, whether or not they're guilty of these specific crimes. So here are some of the known theories and suspects that police and investigators have followed up with over the years. The first is Miguel Colon, an uncle of Carmen's. In this theory, Carmen's murder is not related to the other two girls, and investigators who went down this path believe that Miguel is only responsible for the murder of his niece. Miguel was an uncle on her father's side that eventually started a romantic relationship with her mother, Guillermina, after his brother separated from her. Carmen still called him Uncle Miguel. Though there have never been any reports of physical or sexual abuse from Miguel, some officers speculated that it could have started suddenly, or else that Miguel had successfully intimidated the girl into never telling anybody, that he ultimately murdered her out of fear that his secret would get out. But it was mostly circumstantial evidence that led police to Miguel, some indications that Carmen may have known her killer. Why else would she get into his car so easily? Investigators also noted that Miguel had purchased a car that looked similar to the vehicle seen on Route 104 by dozens of motorists when Carmen was trying to flee from her abductor. Miguel might also have known that Carmen was going to the store that day, or might have seen her in the neighborhood and taken advantage of the circumstances. Adding to this, police found a doll that belonged to Carmen in Miguel's back seat as they were investigating, and noted that the vehicle had been recently cleaned, that it smelled strongly of cleaning products, especially in the trunk. But maybe the biggest red flag for police was the fact that Miguel left Rochester only 4 days after Carmen's death to return to his home country of Puerto Rico, allegedly telling an acquaintance that he was leaving because he had done something bad in Rochester. When police tried to go to Puerto Rico to question him, Miguel tried to flee again, though eventually surrendered to local police and agreed to be questioned by the Rochester investigators. He denied any involvement, but everything about his behavior seemed suspicious to police. But they weren't sure how to proceed with nothing but circumstantial evidence. Many family members also came to Miguel's defense, saying that they would have known if abuse was taking place, that Carmen seemed to ride in Miguel's car without fear, that it made sense that her doll would be there. And of course, if he were the killer, wouldn't he have removed the doll if he went through the trouble of cleaning the entire car? In the end, the case against Miguel was never taken to a grand jury, though some investigators held out hope that he could be charged down the road, that they would eventually uncover something that pointed to Miguel definitively. That opportunity disappeared in 1991, when Miguel committed suicide at the age of 44 after shooting and wounding his wife and brother. Given the violence that marked the end of his life, it's not the craziest stretch to imagine that he would have harmed another member of his family, though admittedly the crime in Carmen's case is very different. But there are plenty of investigators who believe that it was Miguel that killed Carmen to this day. Another man who was seen as a good suspect at the time was Dennis Termini, a 25-year-old Rochester firefighter who was eventually found to have been a serial rapist in the city. He usually targeted teenagers and young women. Known as the garage rapist, he was found to have committed at least 14 rapes in the Rochester area between 1971 and 1973. Another significant detail is that he lived right around the corner from victim Michelle Maenza, and was known to have a beige car that matched the description in at least 2 of these abductions. Dennis Termini became known to police when he tried to abduct a teenage girl at gunpoint just 5 weeks after Michelle was killed, on January 1st, 1974. When the teenager didn't listen to him and began screaming and drawing the attention of bystanders, Dennis fled the scene. It wasn't long before he attempted to rape another little girl in a garage that very same day, though police were nearby and interrupted the attempt, at which point Dennis took off on foot, fleeing over backyard fences and down local streets. In a final act of cowardice and to avoid taking responsibility for his crimes, Dennis shot himself in the head as police were closing in, a suicide that seemed to coincide with the end of the alphabet killings in Rochester. Given his attempts at kidnapping and rape, and also the fact that police found white cat fur on the upholstery in his car, consistent with the fur found on the clothing of Wanda and Michelle, police found it very likely that Dennis was the murderer of at least those 2 girls. There was also additional circumstantial evidence that pointed to him as the killer, that he had a map open in his car to the area where Michelle's body was dumped, and also the fact that he kept his firefighter's uniform in his car, which might have made the girls more inclined to trust him. With Dennis's death and the suspicions involving Miguel, in the eyes of some investigators, the alphabet murders were essentially closed. Even some victims' family members believed the case closed, that Dennis must indeed have been the murderer. Without the ability to do further forensic testing at the time, it was a good bet, but it still wasn't a satisfying conclusion, or the end for the families and the public, many of whom were still left wondering if maybe a killer was still out there. It wasn't until 2007 that the forensics would be tested with more modern technology, and Dennis's body was exhumed to collect DNA evidence to test against the DNA found on Wanda Walkowitz. To the dismay of police and the public, and despite so many clues pointing to Dennis as the killer, the DNA did not match. Over 30 years on, they had not found their killer, leading to even further speculation about who could actually be responsible for the killings and why they ultimately stopped. With the theory of Dennis falling apart, some investigators and armchair detectives have speculated about other potential suspects in this case. One name that gets tossed around a lot is a man named Joseph Nasso, who was born in Rochester in the 1950s. He was arrested in 2011 at the age of 77 for the murders of several women who had the same first and last initial. And he was still living in Rochester in the early 1970s, when Rochester's alphabet killings were taking place. Joseph eventually moved to the West Coast, which is where the crimes he was ultimately convicted of took place. One of the most chilling facts about this theory is that Joseph even killed a woman with the exact same first and last names as one of the Rochester victims, another Carmen Colon. He had killed her in the late 1970s, though this Carmen was in her early 20s at the time of her death. All of these coincidences made police and certainly Carmen's family members think that this must all be connected, that it couldn't possibly be a coincidence, and that they had finally found their man. When you start going down any of these paths, it begins to look very promising at first, because of course, what are the chances that there would be two serial killers with this particular quirk? And this guy was from Rochester and was living there at the time of the alphabet killings. But DNA evidence eventually proved that Joseph Nasso was not responsible for Wanda's killing, and so unlikely responsible for killing any of the girls in Rochester. But this coincidence is so extreme that sometimes it makes me wonder if maybe they shouldn't test it again, if it could have been some error in the lab. Of course, another possible explanation is that the case in Rochester was some kind of sick inspiration for him, that his later killings were a kind of copycat killing to these crimes. Whether the girls in the Rochester case were actually targeted because of their names or not, he might have seen the public speculation, and he may have been inspired to kill based on first and last initial because of this. Having gone down a rabbit hole in looking at Joseph Nasso, I'm actually going to cover him on our next longer format episode, since I had never heard of him before and imagine that there may be other people out there who haven't. So stay tuned for further info about Joseph Nasso next time. But there's actually an even more infamous serial killer, Kenneth Bianchi, who was living in Rochester at the time of the alphabet killings. Given the crimes he went on to commit, many investigators and members of the public have wondered if he might be the person responsible for these crimes. A little background on Kenneth Bianchi for those of you who don't know who he is. Kenneth would later become one of a duo of serial killers that abducted, raped, and tortured young women in the LA area, committing these crimes along with a cousin named Angelo Buono Jr., that were known together as the Hillside Strangler. They were dubbed this in the media before they were captured, before people realized it was two people committing these crimes. Ultimately, they were responsible for the murders of at least 10 women. Some people may know this, but Kenneth Bianchi was actually born in the Rochester area, living there until about 1976, when he was in his mid-20s. Around the time of the alphabet murders, he worked several jobs in the area, including an ice cream vendor known to have worked at locations that were close to the murder scenes of two of the girls. He also worked as a security guard and an ambulance driver, both of which might have been reassuring to potential victims. Kenneth left the city of Rochester for LA in 1976, just about 2 years after the killing of Michelle Maenza. And though he admitted his guilt for the Hillside Strangler cases at least at some point in the investigation, he has always strongly denied that he had anything to do with the alphabet murders in Rochester. The only potential bit of circumstantial evidence that might connect him to these murders, besides the fact that he was ultimately a serial killer and lived in Rochester at the time, was the fact that his car while he lived there somewhat matched the description given in the abductions. It may be worth noting that there is a significant age gap between most of the victims of the Hillside Stranglers and the girls murdered during the alphabet killings in Rochester. Most of the Hillside Strangler victims were in their late teens or early 20s. But maybe that's less important than it seems. And anyway, one of the girls that they were proven to have murdered was only 12 years old, very close to the 10 or 11-year ages of Carmen, Wanda, and Michelle. In researching what testing has been done to explore Kenneth as a suspect, it looks like his DNA has never been tested against that found on the girls in Rochester. That seems like a logical next step to me. But police did try to test some pieces of evidence from Kenneth against the Alphabet murder crimes, trying to match Kenneth's wrist print to one lifted from Michelle's crime scene. His print didn't appear to match, though I have read that wrist prints can change over time with the elasticity of a person's skin, and over 10 years had passed when they finally tested Kenneth's print. So this doesn't seem like a definitive way to rule him out. As of the recording of this podcast in 2020, Kenneth Bianchi is still alive and is somehow eligible for parole in as few as 5 years. And there were other suspects too. A man named James Barber, who had been convicted of abducting and raping a 15-year-old girl, and another man in Michelle's case, who was identified by a witness as having been with the girl that afternoon along the road. He took a polygraph test and passed. Police likely also have their own theories and thoughts about suspects that the public doesn't know about, but nobody has ever been arrested or indicted for these crimes. In recent days, the Rochester Police Department, and indeed several other agencies, have said that they remain committed to solving this case one day. And it is a new era for cold cases. They have been reportedly trying to use new methods of testing. There are also some investigators who were there during the initial investigation who, though retired, still check in regularly with those currently looking at the case to discuss theories, evidence, etc. My hope is that we have the answer to this case soon, for the girls' families and extended families, but also just for Rochester as a whole, as these crimes and the mystery surrounding them has been a cloud over the city, one that was even there while I was growing up, decades later. In terms of why I covered this case, again, there are just certain cases or crimes that stay with you when you're from a certain place, knowing that these things took place on the streets that you are familiar with. For me, I lived in Rochester and I had the same first and last initial. I also was very closely following the Golden State Killer case, and remember the day that it finally broke that they had found him because of some DNA genealogy testing. I called my mom that day. She's kind of a true crime buff or interested in true crime as well. But the win, the high that was, the hope that it shows for all of these victims in these cases that we thought are cold cases that will never be solved. That case in particular made me feel hope. And I feel like something like that might be possible in this case. And anyway, I just want to bring it to light because the more people talk about it, maybe the more likely it is that there will be progress. That it just stays in the public consciousness because somehow I think that makes it closer or more likely that these cases may be solved. As to whether or not I think these cases are connected, I think they might be. Something about the way the crimes went down, I tend to agree that Carmen's case may not be related to the other two, that it may have been a copycat killer that noticed that Carmen had the same first and last initial and then targeted girls because of that. Or it's possible that the initials have nothing to do with it at all, which again seems like such a crazy coincidence, but it's possible. I mean, these kinds of coincidences happen. That's it for this week's episode. Also, we love ratings and reviews if you get a chance. That would really help us out. And thank you so much for listening to the Crime and Sacrifice podcast. What kind of person will you choose to be?